Welcome back to Base Metal Evolution. And in the last episode, I mentioned that there were two innovations that sort of characterized the 80s, and here they are. It is active pickups, is the first one, and boutique amplifiers. So, Rodney, when I think about the 80s, one of the pinnacle amplifiers that come to mind for me is Hartke. And Hartke has quite a place in metal, for sure, in creating their very own technical tone and attributed to lots of artists. Are there any other amps that you can think of that influence that sort of genres or musicians?
Absolutely. Definitely right about Hartke. And one of the other amps coming in would be the Gallion Kruger, especially the 400 and 800 RB. That became just the standard. If you were getting a rock or metal backline during that period, almost for a decade, that was the head you were getting in. And because they didn't have cabs at the time, they were married always to the Hartke 410s with those aluminum cones. Also, you had a little bit later before it got popular in the States, but coming out of the UK, you had Trace Elliot coming in right, I think they were right around 79. They started making a big noise with that, and even players like Steve Harris from Iron Maiden, him using his original Marshall cabinets and everything, but he had that Trace Elliot preamp
That's
that
right.
he used for ages. So really seeing that wave, but especially the Hartke and the GK thing that just became the combo that whether you were in a hair band, a thrash band, whatever it was, odds are you either had one or you played through one at some point. They were just inescapable.
They just have this almost metallic edge by nature, which I love, this very poignant edge. And even like in my David Ellison video, he talks about them as being very poignant and maybe nasal in tone to some degree. So I think it's kind of like how the genres were going. The genres were going where we spoke about before, that the bass player now had their own real estate in the band, and it's like, well, I'm going to go over you, over the guitarist, and under you. So I'm going to occupy both sides of the spectrum and level it out. And I think that's kind of prevalent in most of the music I've listened to from the 80s, like Duff from Guns N' Roses using GK, the same sort of thing, being very balanced on the top and the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Uh, yeah, and you can hear that commonality of tone across them that, as strange as it may be, especially for guys who were in the 80s where there was a lot more war between the camps, you can hear the similarity in tone in between Duff playing something like, the intro to Rocket Queen or something like that. And then you can listen to Among the Living from Anthrax and hear a commonality of what type of sound everybody's starting to gravitate to, or, Megadeth, or, pretty much, again, any guys coming out during that era, even if you weren't using the full rig or the full setup, this kind of a grind and some richness that was being brought along from the older Ampeg type of sound, but being made HD in a way that, like, there was a desire for clarity, not just
Mm-hmm.
boom. And there were guys who maintained that Ampeg camp too. I think that's also when we start to see the revival movement going back to like Stoner and Doom and things like that. Guys going sticking with the fuzz sound, but there very much became this kind of split, gradual increase of splitting in the road in between. You had kind of the Ampeg camp, and then you had the GK Hartke camp, and there were you know two different sounds being molded, and one being much more of a hybrid of borrowing the best parts, I think, from Ampeg, but then trying to improve on it versus people who just kind of were good where they were. But you could see that breakaway happening.
Definitely, for sure. And I think maybe I'm sort of I'm labeling it a little bit, but I was thinking that the Ampeg sort of camp is more purist. Like, this is how we want to drive the amps. This is how the tone should be as a bass, as an instrument. And you find, I guess it's just the new young kids on the block are just taking this new tone, like we said before, making it their own and making it completely different to what the older generation had before.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And then when you tie that in with the birth of the active pickup.
Mm-hmm.
You know, EMG gets founded in '79. It's almost like it breaks open that dam and this thing happens. You know, the EMG PJ set becomes just ubiquitous. I mean, it is the sound of '80s again. Like if you think about all of a lot of these guys' sounds, whether it be Frank Bello or Eddie Jackson from Queensryche, or the PJ combo becomes a really strong fitting for a lot of basses. You start seeing that combo more than others being put in there, or just a single P pickup. And that active sound of much more compressed, much more cutting. It's kind of like that next step from what we were talking about in the last one, where now that bass players have their place and they've been fighting with biamp setups and everything, trying to get this clarity, that the technology caught up with them in an easier way to do it. Mm-hmm. And now that they have the space to do it, they're looking for something much more defined, much more focused, and they want all of their notes to be heard, not just felt. You know, it's a much more punch and driven type of attack rather than a supportive role.
Definitely. And I kind of feel like we spoke before about the medium kind of attributing to how music is played as well. And it kind of feels like this movement towards like punchy and clarity amplifiers, punchy and clarity pickups. I also feel that the medium of the CD had a big impact on how the sounds were being used. So you had your punchy and dynamic amplifiers with their clarity, and the same with the pickups, that they too were punchy and dynamic and had high fidelity and clarity. And it almost feels like just part of the culture of the 80s, where everything was bright and sparkling and beautiful, and it's just sort of like the same with CD. Let's put that onto a CD. And it's away from, like we said, the purists with vinyl, where everything's smooth and warm and there's nice undertones. But in the 80s, everything else was just in your face and loud and sparkling.
Yeah, I think as it's a bit of an aside and stuff, but I think it shows a little bit about human nature in a way too, in that when you had vinyl, you couldn't have a massive amount of low end, because that just ate up more vinyl space and you could fit less songs. So you were kind of limited in what you could do. Then when it came out with the CD and you could get away with that stuff, all of a sudden low end becomes more of a thing, whereas rock starts having more and more, you know, lower tunings, bigger bass in the drums, things like that. And then you look at things in, especially like in the 80s, when you had like more high range singers, then you have guitar players that were using 7-string guitars with a higher string, because it's like, oh, I want to be able to get into that guy's range now. Then when the bottom end and groove becomes bigger and you can get away with it, then all of a sudden now they want the lower strings, and the singers move down to there. So it's always kind of this thing of not just competition with every other instrument that's in the band and trying to run with them, but that human thing of you always want with what you don't have. You know,
exactly.
Once you get the highest of the high notes, now you want the lowest of the low notes. Then, you know, that's why I fully expect like really operatic singing to come back at some point now that we have all the really heavy distorted vocalists. But yeah, I think that's definitely part of that. And you can see it with basses, and that, you know, okay, we've got the distortion, we've got the big sound. Now we want extreme clarity. Mm-hmm. So active pickups, you see all these guys even taking, you know, what's considered heretical at this point, you know, like 60s Fenders and stuff, and putting EMGs in them and ripping up all these old vintage basses to get this new sound. So it just became the thing. It was like, if you weren't cutting through, you weren't cutting it, period. And the gear really starts to reflect that.
Definitely.
I think at this is also when we start to see the beginnings of, in rock, the boutique bass and amp movement. I don't know if you noticed the same thing with some brands or stuff.
Only for what we've discussed before, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it still kind of feels like the boutique stuff applies to the purists, where they're trying to go back to their roots and back to what made them what they are, I guess. Does that kind of sound right to you? Is it sort of like the purists that went back to the boutique stuff?
little bit. I think it goes in two directions, that everybody wanted boutique things, but you have the purists going back and they want, the old precision. They want the old Ampegs. They want, they're paying big dollars to get this vintage equipment that's now just turned vintage because we're up in the 80s. And then you have the new guys that are on the cutting edge wanting the new boutique thing. One of the big names that comes to mind for me is Spectre. That this weird teardrop, tiny looking bass with suddenly, when everybody had these neon colored guitars and everything, all of a sudden you have these, flamed maple and very furniture looking, kind of, I'll say classier or more elegant looking type of things. And I think this is what we can also see is the beginning of bass looking outside of rock and metal. Like we said with Hartke, that becomes the big set, but the first person that made Hartke what it was and what gave him his reputation was Jaco Pastorius. It was like, the seminal jazz and fusion player. And I think actually the first 8-10 he put together may have been made for him. So when you see rock players actually looking at jazz and going, hey, I want to borrow from this, that's a big change in attitudes. It's not a we're rock and you're jazz type of thing. It's going, hey, these guys have figured something out. It's bass becoming a community cross-platform rather than rock players on their instruments, jazz players, that instruments start finding commonality with other people who play the same instrument in different genres of music. So when you see, guys like Dave LaRue or something like that early on playing Spectre, and then you can also go to, a metal show and see even, later on in the 80s and early 90s, like death metal guys starting to use Spectre. Or, anything up to Queensryche, bands like this. That to me was a really striking kind of thing of seeing the same gear and sound and approach at a fusion gig that I'm then seeing at a metal show. So you're boutique and things that aren't necessarily, I have to have the metal rig. There isn't as much a metal rig. There's what's the hot bass rig. And that goes across all forms of music. So it becomes less kind of tribal, and metal becoming, I think, maybe grown up in a way, in that it starts to get a little bit of respect because you see boutique instrument manufacturers starting to look at metal guys as going, hey, they've earned their attention and we're going to start marketing to them and that kind of thing. When you could see, someone like maybe Jimmy Hayslip or something, these amazing fusion players in the same ad as like, Eddie Jackson or Duff McKagan or something. It's a big, how do you want to say, like a world change has kind of gone on underneath the feet, where you would never have seen those two players referenced at the same time before.
I sort of want to touch on what you said before about bass players being a bit more cohesive as a group rather than a tribe. And it seems like the amplifiers at the time, let's take Hartke for example, is there anything that you can think of that would bring everyone together? Is it just more of a everybody wants clarity kind of thing rather than, I don't know, bottom end or something?
I think there's probably two things going on. Is one, there is that now that fidelity's opened up and bass can have it, that bassists across genres all kind of zero in on wanting the same thing. So they realize kind of a commonality of, hey, we're all after, standing way out front now. And I think part of it is too, again, kind of that growth of metal, in that it starts to become accepted as something that's not going away. And the players in it are actually credible. And I think, especially at the same time, seeing this also being the era of, the rock guitar god. And even going into like the shrapnel era, the 80s, you saw everything coming from Eddie Van Halen up to Paul Gilbert and, the shrapnel label guys and Yngwie, and it's undeniable the skill level that's in metal now. and that goes to, bleeds out into bass too, that they start seeing metal guys as their peers and the sharing back and forth. But I think that metal players growing at that point also meant that because they were getting acceptance and they realized the commonality, they started looking to other forms for inspiration musically, not just metal. And I think that's where you start seeing, I mean, the explosion of influences that happened in different genres in metal. You have progressive metal became far more of like a fusion influence type of thing, where you have like bands like Fate's Warning and Watchtower and stuff like that, where they start watching that. And then you have the funk metal type of thing, that not the later rap metal type of thing that happened, but you actually have funk, like the mildest version being, you can't really call it metal, but somewhat of a crossover with like the Chili Peppers and stuff. But you had Mind Funk and tons of other bands. You see the beginnings of people starting to mess with slap bass in hard rock and metal. So they're reaching out to funk and jazz and going like, okay, we've pushed this as far as we can, so now we're having to look outside ourselves. And that becomes an accepted thing because they're feeling the respect from those players and feeling more, we're a bass community regardless of what we're playing, rather than, again, metal guys are over here, jazz guys are over there, that kind of thing. That the cross and hybridization of respect and influence, I think, really leans into that too. And when you hear, a fusion guy who can cut through a mix and the bass is really prominent and commanding, even if you're in a metal band, you kind of have to look at that and go like, I want to do that thing.
I think also that music was much more accessible, like in things like MTV, for example, that there's just more entry points to see different types of things. And so again, there's that cohesion. I also wanted to go back to pickups. And from my experience, in every artist that I've covered on my channel, every one of them has EMG pickups. And personally, I haven't played them. If that's sinful or not, I don't know, but I haven't played them before. But I can appreciate their clarity and, as we've been saying, fidelity. Why do you think that nearly every player on my channel, for example, plays EMG pickups? What is it that you think draws players to them?
Well, there's two things that go on, I think, with active pickups, period. But EMG kind of being the pioneer on that one, is that a crucial thing about cutting through or being defined for bass is compression. And having outside compressors and things are still a 50-50 thing. Guys like Sheehan or Getty and guys like that are using it, but a lot of players are still straight into the amp. So having a pickup that's already compressed gives you that cut immediately. And the other is that they, being the forerunners, they were just the top of the game when it went, if you want this hyper clear sound, there's one name in town. And there's something to be said for being an early adopter, and especially if you get it right. Like I said, I mean, the EMG PJ set is still used today and sought after, and you can go to companies, Schecter, ESP, like tons of these companies that are still using that same pickup set stock. They've put out different preamp versions and things like that, but their core line of pickups is still based on what they were doing from the beginning. So, I mean, they're obviously still in business doing it. Every guitar line that's commercially done seems to have EMGs in it. So, really, especially, again, in metal and needing so much clarity to cut through a wall of guitars, that it took a while for passive technology to kind of catch up with that and realize they needed to start winding different and doing some things to keep up with that. And two is that when something defines a genre or a sound, then everybody is going to gravitate to it. When every time you look around, the bass player who's cutting through the mix the best is always using the same thing, it makes a humongous difference. I mean, like right off the top of my head, thinking about like on my show's Metal Bass Microscope and stuff, some of the guys going through, you think of almost every bassist from the 80s that's starting to use the boutique gear, starting to do that. You see these same names coming up here. Rex Brown, Spectre and EMG pickups. Again, Eddie Jackson from Queensryche, Spectre and EMG. Frank Bello, ESP Fender, and EMG pickups. It's like this constant reoccurring theme. So it's right time, right innovation, and they seem to have been able to tune a specific sound with the few pickup options that they had that exactly did the job also according to what the guitar player was doing. You know, I've played some active pickups too that maybe had the same clarity and everything, but just the way they were dialed in, it didn't cut the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for how guitar players were dialing in their sound, this bass sound just seemed to find that hole and drive right through the middle of it. And it exploited that kind of loophole in, you know, where the guitar player wasn't hearing importance in his sound, they tuned those pickups perfectly to get through there. So it became a no-brainer. It was like, if you want to be heard, you grab a set of these, retrofit your bass, and, you know, you're 80% of the way there. So I think, you know, again, it's one of those combinations. It's kind of like being the Apple of, you know, active bass pickups. It's like, you know, we hit it first in the market and just caught what people seemed to, you know, they had their finger on the pulse of it, and you just take over a market.
I just can't believe how popular they are and have been for many years now. So I need to try them out.
Oh, I might be able to help out in that. So
that'd be nice.
We'll talk after. But yeah, and I think that's, again, like it becomes just the go-to name. And when something gets to that level of popularity, a lot of people, they don't gear nerd out that heavy. They want to get from point A to point B quickly. And when, like with GK and Hartke, it just becomes the, you know, I'm going to be in a metal band. You know, what sound do I need? It's like, okay, here's your 800 RB. Here's your Hartke cabinets. You're done. They don't have to think about it. They're just going to go for that. And then when they go, okay, my bass doesn't sound quite the way I want it to, I'm not cutting through. Here's your EMG PJ setup. You're done. You know, a lot of players just want that. Show me how to get there. You know, they're not necessarily, yeah, they don't want to shop around. They don't want to do a bunch of stuff. It's like, give me the thing that works and let's go. And that's one of the things too, is EMG has a very characteristic sound that, while your instrument, it can, one of the things that some people call a detriment, but, you know, for me, I've always looked at somewhat of an advantage, is you're going to have a fairly consistent sound when the pickup determines so much more of the tone. You know, like if you're going through different basses, they'll all sound slightly different and have their own character and things, but there's not going to be this massive tonal difference when you're using EMGs or something, because they have so much of their character built into it, and it's the compression and everything, that you can put a set of EMGs into a crappy bass and have it sound good, versus if you have a set of pickups that are really dependent on the bass being quality, you're kind of still out of luck on that one. So I think that makes probably a huge difference in that too, is that you have players who are struggling to afford this gear, or they're not able to do, you know, the massive outlays for really high end and quality gear. They're like, okay, I spent a ton on this amp setup and everything. I need to get a good sound. And somebody goes, new set of pickups, you know what it's going to sound like, done.
And like a quick fix, just the low hanging fruit. Change your strings, change your pickups, off you go.
Yeah, exactly. It's, you know, I can't afford a Spectre. Okay, let's take your bolt-on Fender copy, drop those EMGs in it, and you're going to be 80% of the Spectre tone, you know, right there. That has a big draw, I'm sure. Pro level sound available at the lower price point, regardless of your gear. So a lot of angles kind of meeting at a perfect storm, just kind of taking over the zeitgeist on what bass players are doing.
Do you think, you might know better than I do, what came first in terms of EMG pickups? Uh, like active pickups. Did they come first? Was that their innovation, or was it
Hmm.
passive first and then active? Like
As
how did that come about?
as far as I know, they started with the active pickups. I could be wrong. I'm not sure, but I know uh, the thing that really kind of established them and that they became known for was definitely the active. I believe it was the guitar came first, and then quickly after was I believe the P pickup. I'm pretty sure of it was the main thing, and that became kind of the big thing too. Is people wanting replacement P pickups. Most people had a precision, something like that. Jazz wasn't quite as common, so you have uh, people wanting something they can drop into a Fender quickly. So yeah, EMG really did just kind of have everything covered, and it was the go-to thing. But then towards the end of the 80s, it starts morphing again, I think when you start seeing like Bartolini coming into the market, other active pickup makers like that, and you see the boutique bass market really kind of spread out. Instead of just being like Spectre and a couple other options, you have, Tobias. I remember even John Young from Dream Theater coming in with Spectre, and I think he had a Tobias for a while. You get Zahn, you get, Ken Smith, tons of other builders start coming in, and there's kind of this explosion of boutique but being used by common players kind of thing. And that goes along again with the cross platform. You start,
Mm.
seeing guys who are doing funk and fusion using the same new boutique gear that the guys in metal are. And that kind of starts another wider split in just influence and gear. Did you notice the same thing, or kind of like that era changing and kind of this 10-year cycle that keeps happening?
Yeah, I mean, like we've been saying all through the episodes, there are cycles, and it seems that we've gone from to sort of taking what we got to let's try and over-engineer this. Like, how can we do? How can we make it really technical? And especially with like bases like the Tobias bases and the Zom bases, they seem overly engineered, and I I struggle personally to wonder who they're aiming at. Um, but don't get me wrong when I say that rock stars in the 80s were simple minded, that's not what I mean, but they sort of just picked up what they felt like. There wasn't like a specific reason for the bass they chose. It looks good rather than a specific reason. So I wonder where the market demand for these basses came from. If the zeitgeist, if you like, was sort of like, that'll do.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's part of that. There can also be it's everybody's always going to go for what becomes a gold standard established. It's like the guys I see in traffic in LA driving a Maserati doing 30 miles an hour in rush hour traffic. It's like, really, you need it? Okay, but he still wants to have the
Mm.
$200,000 car driving so slow I could run past him if I got out of line. So I think there's a little bit of that. Everybody wants the bragging rights of having the top of the line gold standard on something. And I think maybe part of it is it's that searching. It's going, oh, okay, this is the new and the thing. I'm going to try this out because musically I haven't figured out what the new is. Tone wise, I haven't figured out. Maybe this gives me an answer. Or this fusion player I respect is using this, so I'm going to try and use it in metal, and maybe that aligns me with him a little bit.
Mm.
Uh, and I definitely see that. And I don't know if you agree, but again, that 10-year cycle that this split gets even bigger going into the 90s, that two other things happen where, again, it's a technology thing and it's a style thing where the rift in between those splits much larger. Do you kind of see the same thing starting to go
Oh,
through?
for sure. It just seems that every generation it splits again into more camps and just keeps going sideways. And like you said, there are just more camps now. There's more crossover, more pollination, more innovations, and it's just like everybody's. By the time at the end of the 80s, it's sort of like let's move on to something completely different. And I think we're kind of getting there with the 90s and into grunge and into funk styles and funk rock and all those sort of things. And I think I don't know how the change came about, but it felt like, all right, we're done with the metal thing now. Let's move on to something different.
Definitely, and I think that's what the next step is going to be. And in a way, I see that and one other thing going on. There's a kickback or a push against what was going on, and then there's also one that went even further with it. It's almost like this. It went in two radically different directions. Instead of like one gradual movement, you had two camps that went out. And again, one is a stylistic change, and the other is a technology jump forward. So those two things are going to kind of define the next era. And to find out what those are, both of them, you'll have to check out my channel next week for the follow-up on episode 4 on Wednesday, as always.
A great conversation as always, and make sure you go and watch the next episode exclusively on Rodney's channel. See you next week.